Okay, I think we'll get started. Judy stepped out for a minute, but I think she'll be back in a moment, and we can get the ball rolling and catch her up. This Seder, how's everyone doing?
Okay, thank you.
Good, good. So let's start. We'll see if we get through the second half of chapter 3 today, because I want to start with our field trip to the word chayfetz, right? Ethan put in a special request last week to look into the word chayfetz, and I think it's a very good idea, and it was a very interesting exercise in a few things. So I think that's a good place to start, because that's one of the key parts of the chapter. So just to refresh us, the first verse, the very beginning of the chapter says, La kol zman ve'es l'chol chayfetz tachas hashamoyim, right? That for everything there's a time, and there's a time or a season for every chayfetz under the sun. And a time for, right, in the Pete Seeger Birds song, they translated a time for every purpose under heaven. I've got Art Scroll says there's a time for everything under heaven. Right. So what is this word chayfetz? And what is interesting about this is that really at its core, the root, ches pei tzadi, the root is a root that means desire, right? Most of where it shows up, it's talking about desire. Again, that's in biblical Hebrew. And then by the time we get to modern Hebrew, by the time we get to the Mishnah already, actually, so that's already 2,000 years ago, ish. By the time we get to the Mishnah, it comes to mean an object. It comes to mean business. So I'm just going to share a few definitions and a few comments so that we have a full understanding. So I checked, the first place I checked was the Brown Driver Briggs Dictionary, which is like one of the classic definitive dictionaries of biblical Hebrew. And there, the first definition it gives is delight or pleasure. The second definition it gives is desire or longing. And the last one that is linked with, that he links anyways, with Kohelet is, quote, that in which one takes pleasure. And so part of that could be business, or, business or affairs like that. And he even mentions that in very late Hebrew, in Mishnaic Hebrew, it literally means a thing or an object. So that's the BDB. Jastrow says similar, and Jastrow is a dictionary on, it's more on the Mishnah and the Gemara and the Midrashim, so it's dealing with Aramaic and it's dealing with a little bit of later Hebrew. So there he says thing or object. Chayfetz is a thing or object. Or again, two is more how we're using it here: concern, business, etc. The modern Hebrew dictionary, the Alkali, which is a great dictionary, it has every definition that we've just said. It includes all of those definitions. In Hebrew, a chafetz chashud is like, that's what they call, like, if you see like a backpack at like a bus stop, and God forbid you're concerned there, it's a suspicious object. That's what they call it, chafetz chashud. So that's like the same root, same basic word. So that's chafetz as an object. To give the two frummer approaches to this, which line up with the dictionaries, but the Targum, the Aramaic translation of Kohelet, translates the word chayfetz as iska, which iska is Aramaic. It's like the word in Hebrew asek, right? Again, that's like business, or it's like what you're involved with, something that you're involved in. That's iska, business, worldly occupation, right? So that's how the Targum translates it. And then Rashi has a very interesting comment. Rashi says l'chol chayfetz, l'chol davar, right? He translates it l'chol davar, for anything, right? There's a time for everything under heaven. That's how Art Scroll translates it, and that makes sense because they usually go with Rashi. So says Rashi l'chol davar, it means for everything. Kol hadvarim kiruim chafetzim beloshin hamishna. All dvarim, all things are called chafetzim, right? In the language of the Mishnah, meaning in the language of the Mishnah, it uses the word chayfetz in place of davar. So Rashi is saying they're interchangeable over here, and that Kohelet is using Hebrew akin to the way that it's used in the Mishnah, which leaves which translates chayfetz as a thing. So what I think we come away with is we're not talking about what's the purpose of life, like, broadly, like in the what's life's purpose, right? L'chol chayfetz doesn't mean for every purpose. I mean, that's maybe included in it, but on a simple level, chayfetz here means any sort of worldly occupation or any kind of. I mean, again, if you want to work with the word desirable, that's an interesting knetch. I don't know how to tie that in exactly, but the simplest translation seems to be that there's a time for every matter, every again, worldly pursuit, I guess, under heaven. So that's what I found for chayfetz. Thoughts, questions?
What line are you on?
Oh, so we were just going back to the word chayfetz in the beginning.
Well, I think it's fascinating because it's saying some version of, there's a time for everything, and it's almost literally amoral, that there's no judgment at all. Like everything has its moment. Evil has its moment. That's a kind of a dangerous idea for a Jew, and the fact that everything wants to be. I like the desire element because it's like everything wants to be, everything wants to come into being, and that's also a kind of it borders on, I won't quite say idolatry, but it borders on looking at as inanimate objects being animate. And I think it's, again, captures this very unusual mood and a point of view that you find in Kohelet, that it's like, we are here, we've arrived, and look what is here before us, after us, and among us. And it's very kind of a neutral thing. All these things have their moment and have their time. And this is the world we live in. It's not so moral.
Yeah, no, that's good. And that's going to set us up for the second half of this chapter. But I think that is reinforced, right? All of the pairs that we saw in the first, 8 verses, they seem consistent with that. There's a time for the good stuff, there's a time for the bad stuff, there's a time for the building, and a time for the destruction. There's very little, he assigned very little moral qualities to any of them. We'll see if the second half reinforces that or tempers that a little bit. So I think we should pick up from verse 9. I know we did that last week, but I think it's a good place to just pick up and keep going. So it says verse 9, Ma yisron ha'ose ba'asher hu omel, right? What profit is there for that which a person does? And again, omel here, amelus, it's working. It might have the connotation of overworking, right? Like, what's the point of overworking? Do what you need to do, but to be super ambitious and to go above and beyond maybe doesn't make sense. And again, we see this word yisron, which we are developing a translation of yisron as sort of eternal profit rather than worldly profit. Again, I don't think it's true every time in Kohelet that we've seen so far, but I think it rings true broadly, and I think it's a good distinction. Okay, so says Shlomo in verse 10, Ra'isi es ha'inyan asher nasan Elohim livnei ha'adam la'anos bo, right? I have seen the matter which God places humans to be involved with, right? I've seen the state of the world that God created for people, essentially. Es hakol asa yafa ve'ito, everything that he did is beautiful within its time, right? Within its context. Right. Again, water is a neutral thing. Water is, this is an example that I got from a Professor Kimmelman in college. Water, when it comes out of the tap, is great. It's a good thing to have a tap in your house where you can turn it on and that water comes through and it flows. That's a good thing. When the pipe bursts and the water floods your basement, the water is not such a good thing. But it's water. Water is a beautiful thing. It just is a thing, and in certain contexts it's great, and in certain contexts it's less great. Everything that God does is beautiful in its time. Gam es ha'olam nasam belibam מבלי אשר לא ימצא האדם es המעשה אשר עשה האלוהים מראש ועד סוף. So this is a very difficult Hebrew, or I found it to be very difficult anyway. But I'm going to try it like this, right? God also implanted eternality in the minds or in the hearts of people, but without the ability for a person to know what God did or what God will do. That's my loose translation over here. Right. Olam is an interesting word, right? It says, Gam es olam nosan belibam, right? God also put olam in the hearts of people. Olam, we think of in modern Hebrew, we think about it as meaning the world, right? And some of the translations here translate it that way, that God put the world in the hearts of people. But in the Bible, the word olam almost always means eternal, right? It's talking more about eternality. Right. It's talking about, right, in the Bible, it's talking eternality. And so what I think is nice about that is that I think that illustrates what Shlomo Melech is going through in the narrative over here. Right? God plants within us this awareness of eternality, maybe this desire, this drive for eternality, and yet at the same time limits our ability to engage with it. This is verse 11. I'm just checking. I had something here. Yeah, he plants this grandiose preoccupation in our hearts, but it's beyond us. It's not revealed to us. All of God's workings are not revealed to us from beginning to end. And that I think is the wrestling that Shlomo Melech is doing right now, that we have this awareness and this desire for eternality, but we don't have the ability to truly access it. So now we'll see again an interesting piece. This is where Shlomo finds meaning in life, right? It's not that everything is hefker and everything is bad, and that everything is bad. He says, Yodati ki ein tov bum, there's nothing good for people, ki im except lismoach velasos tov b'chayav, right? To rejoice and to do good in this lifetime. And I think that's a very Jewish concept in many ways, especially to do good in one's lifetime, right? I think it's become a little bit of a trope that Judaism emphasizes action over belief, and I think that is largely true. And I think this is a good expression of it, right? This is even independent of what the next life could look like, independent of eternality. He does say in this world, it's good to be happy, right? God doesn't want us to be miserable. It's good to be happy and to do good in the world, right? That's called living within the context of this life. Those are good things. Those are essential and good things. V'gam kol ha'adam, right? Verse 13, sheyochal v'shasa, right? And so too, any person who eats, who drinks, v'ra'a tov b'chol amaloi, and sees all good, sees any kind of good from their occupation, matas Elohimhi, that's a gift from God, right? The fact that we have food, the fact that we have sustenance, and the fact that we can find meaning in our work, that's a gift from God. That's a good thing. So again, he's not walking around life saying that everything is pointless, right? Here is where some of the meaning within life comes in. It's just that, again, I think one of the main ideas we're developing over these weeks is that what's really bothering him is that it doesn't go past this life. Thoughts or questions until this point?
Well, the only thing I would say is those verses all the way to the end are basically involving God. And to have Kohelet be described as the book is quote irreligious or ignores God or is just really weird to read this and to say, how did that emerge? How can anybody say that? This is literally a contemplation of God's place in the world and God's place in human life. I mean, I don't know what's more quote religious than that.
Yeah. 100%, 100%. That's exactly what I was thinking when I was learning through this part of the chapter. I was like, it's not a throwaway line at the end of the book. There's real pieces where he's engaging with God and God's place in it. So good. So says verse 14, Yodati ki kol asher ya'asu Elohim hu yihyeh le'olam, right? Anything that God does, it's eternal. It's eternal. Alav ein lahosif, you can't add to it. Umimenu ein ligroya, and you can't subtract from it. Ve'o Elohim also sheyiru milfanov, and God does it, or God either does what God does in order that we're in awe of God, or God created a world in which we're supposed to be in awe of God. That's sort of how I understand that verse. But the main thing that I saw in this verse is that God does have access to this eternality that Shlomo is chasing and that he can't grab. That's God's bread and butter, right? Anything that God does, it's eternal and it's perfect, right? Not so for us, yes, so for God. And in fact, that inspires awe. That does inspire awe in people because we can't do that. We're unable to access that, and so to be confronted with God who does, that is something to be in fear and or awe of. Masha Hoya Kvarhu, right? This idea we've seen before. That which was already happened. Vasher Lios, and that which will be Kvar Hoya, already happened. Veho Elohim yivakesh es nirdaf, and God pursues the pursued. The classical commentaries translate this basically as right. It feels like a non sequitur. In the classic commentaries, this becomes a non sequitur, but they translate it as God looks out for the oppressed. Right? Rashi says that Elohim yivakesh es nirdaf. Rashi says that's God. God will demand, will judge or avenge the one who's being pursued by the pursuer, meaning the oppressed. God's going to go after the oppressor. The Odra Isi Tachas Hashemesh, right? I also saw under the sun, Makom Hamishpat Shama Haresha, that in the place of justice, there's also evil. Umakom Hatzedek Shama Harasha, and in the place of righteousness, there's also evil. Now, what's interesting is are they concurrent? Right? That is there always evil along with justice? Is there always evil along with righteousness? Is this a comment on corruption? Right? Where there should be justice, there's evil. Where there should be righteousness, there's evil. How do you folks understand this verse?
There's justice and righteousness and wickedness,
Okay.
and that they exist on the same plane. They exist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exist in the same society, in the same under the sun. It
Nice.
exists under the sun.
Nice. So Judy is saying that, right, under the sun, right, within the context of existence, within human existence, there's justice and there's wickedness, there's righteousness and there's wickedness, right? They're all there, and I do think thematically that does fit, right? Because he's equating a lot of disparate things. So I think that makes sense. I just always get a little excited when I see something in the Bible that says, "Oh, you who think you're so righteous, you're really there's wickedness there." So maybe that's a little bit what's going on, but maybe not. Amarti ani belibi, I said to myself, Esat Sadik ve'esa Rasha, right? This I think is going to support what Judy was saying. Amarti ani belibi, I said to myself, Esat Sadik ve'esa Rasha, Yishpat Elohim. God's going to sort them out. God's going to judge the righteous and the wicked. Ki es lechol chayfetz. There's that word chayfetz again, right? Because there's a time for every pursuit, every purpose. Ve'al kol hamase sham. And for every action that's there. Right. So again, this borders on amoral, right? This borders on not immoral necessarily, but amoral. Right. God's going to sort them out. There's a time and purpose for everyone. Maybe, and I think maybe that's probably the simple meaning, is that we're not always able to distinguish who's in the right and who's in the wrong. God's going to know if what this person did at its core was bad or it was good, and God's going to judge accordingly. It also just brings to mind the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, fourth chapter of Pirkei Avos, the third Mishnah. It says, "Hu haya omer al tihi vaz l'chol adam." Don't despise any person. Ve'al tihi maflig l'chol davar, and don't discriminate against anything. She'ein l'cha adam she'ein lo shah, because there's no person without their moment. Ve'ein l'cha davar she'ein lo makom, and there's no thing without its place. So that's an interesting parallel in the Mishnah that this reminds me of. Okay, we're doing good. Okay, I think we will get through the chapter today. Amarti ani belibi. I said to myself, Al divras b'nei ha'adam levaram ha'elohim liros shehem behema hema lahem. Right, this is also a tricky one to translate. But I said to myself that, okay, let me just read it from the our scroll here. Then I said to myself, concerning men, God has chosen them, but only to see that they themselves are as beasts, right? God has chosen us, which is a very lofty idea. But part of our existence is, I guess, recognizing our animal state, which is interesting also, right? I mean, this is not to muddy the waters with just like modern religious, I don't know, culture wars, I don't know, but like usually religion and science, like, oh, religion, like humans transcend animals, and science, oh, humans are just animals, you know. But here's an interesting religious treatment of the ways in which humans are parallel to animals, right? I can give you all kinds of religious ideas that make the distinction, and those are true and good and important. But again, when we're talking about this world versus eternality, there's a lot about us that is animalistic. And that's a real part of who we are and what we have to engage with. But again, in keeping with the theme of the chapter and the book, he says, Ki mikra v'nei adam umikra habehema umikra echad lahem kamos zeh kain mos zeh ruach echad lakol. Right? The things that happen to people, or the destiny of people, the end of people, and the end of animals, umikra echad lahem. They all have one destiny. They all have one happening. Kemos zeh, kain mos zeh. Like this one dies, so that one dies. V'ruach echad lakol, and all have the same spirit. Umosar ha'adam min ha'behema ayin. And man has there's nothing better about being a human. There's no preeminence of a human being above an animal, ki hakol havel, because everything is vanity. And if we say fleeting, everything is fleeting, I think that works very nicely here, actually, because again, he's concerned, he's not hating on this life as much as he's distraught that this life doesn't continue, right? This life ends, this world ends. And in the context of the world, our end is the same as an animal's end. And we shouldn't, our end is the same as an animal's end. I'm just going to read the last few verses and then we'll talk. Hakol holeich el makom echad. Everybody goes to the same place. Hakol hoya min ha'afar. Everything came from the dust. Ve'akol shavel ha'afar. And everything's going to return to dust. Mi yodea ruach b'nei adam ha'oila hi lamala. V'ruach ha'behema ha'yeredes hi lamato la'aretz. Right? Who knows? Who says that the spirit of a human being transcends up above, goes up above, and the spirit of an animal descends below, which is interesting, right? I don't know that we normally say, I don't know who says this, honestly. This seems to be an independent idea in here. But I mean, I think these days we think of the human soul as ascending to heaven after death. But the truth is, when the Tanakh talks about dying, usually it's talking about the soul descending. So that's an interesting distinction here. But so he's nodding to this idea that a human being's soul goes up and an animal's, I guess, doesn't. He's not denying that it's the case, but he is saying we can't, like, who's to, like, right? He's not saying it's not true, but he is saying, how do we know it's true? I guess he's bringing in that at the end of the day, it's not revealed to us. We don't know this 100%. Right? And here again, he tempers it with a little bit more of what is good, right? I saw that the only good is that a person should rejoice or be happy in their labors, in their work. Kihu chelko, because that's his chelek, right? Again, here's chelek as the portion in this world, right? That's the chelek, that's what a person is working on in this world, and that's worthwhile. Because who knows what's coming after? Who's going to show this person what comes after them, right? Be concerned and be happy with what you're doing here and now, because you don't know what's going to come next. Which again is grappling with the fleetingness of life, but is still infusing meaning into that life. There is meaning within this fleeting life. It just doesn't follow us after the grave. Thoughts, questions? We did a bunch of at once.
Well, I'm very impressed and a little mystified that, you know, he erases the distinction between man and beast. You know, we're
It's
supposed to be the
interesting,
crown
no?
of creation.
Yeah,
And it's then borders again on almost the heretical that
yeah,
he's saying, you know, we're just like the cows and the cattle, which I find fascinating. And in fact, the whole relationship between man and beast in Torah is interesting. There really is a fellowship between man and beast, the way Torah sees the world, which I always found interesting. These societies were not exactly humanistic societies. And yet
sure.
you see here that very much there is a continuum between man and beast. And, you know, again, we're born on the last day of creation, and you see in the laws relating to the care of animals that, you
Yeah.
know, they matter in a profound, profound way. So I find all these 4 verses really, really interesting. And the other thing that
Yeah.
always occurred to me tonight, Rob, was there's no messianism in Kohelet that I can remember. There's
Not
no
so far.
reference
No one.
Not
to, it's really, and
messianism.
that it's just not there. Like there's no, okay, but then any version of Mashiach, end of times, Kohelet does seem to have a view that this is the permanent condition of earth and man.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. I don't know. That's a big, it's a big question for we religious folks. It's a big question, and it's one that we're going to have to come back to. But I do think he's not denying it. He's just not addressing it. And the fact that he's not addressing it and is putting so much into the idea that this is so fleeting, it's troubling. It's troubling, right? This is again at the very first class. The Chazal were not sure whether this should be included in the biblical canon or not. There was debate about it. And I think that's one of the major reasons. It's not the reasons that they cited, but I do think that that's one of the borderline heresies that we have to engage with when we're engaging with this. But what I do think works in how we've been learning Koheles and his equation of humans and animals is that on the subject of mortality, which is what he seems to be hung up on, when it comes to mortality, that is something that we are, animals and humans are the same when it comes to mortality. When it comes to immortality, there are good religious discussions to be had, but when it comes to mortality itself, humans and animals are indistinguishable. So in that context, I think it works.
Mhm. Good point. Also, Rabbi, you know, some people say that part of Kohelet is satirical, and he's really just
Okay.
trying to teach a lesson. And he's saying, hey, you're just like a beast. You know,
Okay.
you deny you're just a donkey or a mule, but you don't really know how serious he's being, because to some degree, this is a teaching document. And he maybe is trying
Okay.
to say, you know, get your head out of the clouds,
Yeah.
you leave your immorality and your self-satisfaction behind. All of your temples are meaningless, and come down to earth. So I don't know how true that is, but that is something I've read about Kohelet, is sometimes that he is trying to teach and make a point, and he, quote, is not serious at all.
And it has that feeling to it a little bit, right? Because it's so edgy in its way. It's like, oh, you lofty human beings, you're no better, really you're no better than a cow. So agreed that could be part of it. And the satirical point is interesting, right? That always makes it, that's going to be a good thing to keep in mind also, because it's always tricky to tease out where something is or isn't being satirical, but that's good. This Seder. So that's the end of the chapter, and we're holding by around 8 o'clock. So any final questions or thoughts before we sign off for the evening?
Chodesh Tov.
Okay,
But,
everyone should have a
Hopefully you
photo.
have
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. A good Kodesh, and next week should be back to normal again. So very good. We'll see you then. Mirza Shem.